Thanks, everyone, for joining our Budget Beat call. This is Precious Buchu, Outreach and Operations Coordinator at the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. Today on Budget Beat, we will talk with members of our fiscal policy team about the House and Senate budget proposals released over the last 2 weeks. For those of you who are not familiar with the Budget and Policy Center, we are a research organization dedicated to advancing the prosperity of all Washingtonians. We host these calls throughout the legislative session to provide relevant information and news from Olympia. A few quick housekeeping notes before we jump in. There are a number of people on the line, so we have muted all lines to avoid background noise. If you have questions for us, please send them to us using the chat function on ReadyTalk. We will respond to as many as we can during the call. We will also be recording this Budget Beat webinar, which will be posted to our website soon. So, as I've said, the focus of today's call is the 2 budget proposals recently introduced in the legislature. The House Democrats, who have a narrow majority, released their plan last week. And the Senate Republicans, who also have a narrow majority, released their plan the week before that. We'll hear from Andy Nicholas, Associate Director of Fiscal Policy, and Kelly Smith, Policy Analyst, who will delve into what these proposals include and do not include. So let's start with a high-level overview of these 2 budgets. Kelly, why don't you tell us some of the main differences and similarities?
Thanks, Precious. So it's safe to say that we have 2 very different budgets between the House and Senate. From the very highest level, the House Democrats' budget would make some strong investments in communities, and the Senate budget proposal is pretty grim for working families, for people with disabilities, and for seniors. So on similarities, there's one. Both budgets balance, but they do so in vastly different ways. So the House bill would spend about $1.6 billion more overall than the Senate budget. But really the major difference is that the House budget would increase spending levels by about $3 billion, and it would actually pay for those investments with new revenue from equitable and sustainable sources. The Senate plan, on the other hand, raises revenue using a property tax levy swap. It's something that we've talked about a lot in the past. It involves a state property tax increase combined with a local property tax decrease, and it has no offsets for the lowest income households. But the big story with the Senate budget is that it makes very deep cuts to some of our state's most crucial programs. And it combines those cuts with some accounting gimmicks, some fund transfers, in order to balance without significantly raising net revenue. So that's one overarching difference that is really important to keep in mind as we have these discussions. And now in terms of spending, when we talk about budgets being value statements, it's clear that there are very different values at play between the House and the Senate on these budget proposals. We can go into more details about these, but at a very high level, the House plan invests in programs that lift up working families. For instance, it boosts funding for TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, boosts funding for Work First. It boosts funding for Housing and Essential Needs Program and the Aging, Blind, and Disabled programs. The Senate plan, on the other hand, would gut, and in some cases even proposed to eliminate some of these programs. It also swept a large chunk of money out of TANF and used it to backfill cuts in higher education and other unrelated areas of the budget. Another major difference between the budgets is that the House's budget actually funds the contracts that state workers negotiated with the governor, and the Senate refuses to fund all but a couple of the collective bargaining agreements that were negotiated by our frontline workers. So these are just some high-level examples of differences, but I'd say that overall there are both structural fiscal differences as well as major departures in terms of what investments are prioritized between the 2 budget plans.
Thanks, Kelly. Let's dig into the details then. Andy, one of the most important measures of a budget is whether it is actually adequate to fund the investment it makes. Can you talk a little bit about the adequacy of these 2 budget proposals? Do they fund our state's most crucial investments? And if not, what gets left out and what impact will that have?
Thanks, Precious. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in on this beautiful morning after Bertha has broken through. I know that's been the major thing on my mind. No, but so if we would just move on to the slide here. So for those of you that are on Ready Talk right now and are thinking about something other than the Bertha breakthrough, what we have here is the differences between the Senate and House budget proposals by different areas of our progress index. And so we divide the budget up into 4 value areas. And what you can see here is that when it comes to investments in community development and trust, the Senate would slash funding overall for that fundamental area by 1.8%, whereas the House would increase funding by about 11.2%. When it comes to investments in economic security, the Senate would propose, and Kelly alluded to some of these earlier, a pretty devastating 13% reduction in that area of the budget, while the House would trim investments by about a little less than 1%. However, there's a caveat there, and I think we'll discuss that as we get into things. For investments in healthy people and environment, the Senate makes a modest 1% increase in those areas of the budget, while the House does a much more significant 6.3% increase. And then in education, which is really one of the major driving factors of these two budgets, the Senate increases state investments in schools by about 7%, whereas the House increases them by about 7.9%. So some pretty stark differences, at least at that 50,000-foot level, in terms of the major values that Washingtonians come together to fund as part of their budget.
So it looks like there are major differences when it comes to investments in economic security and community development and trust. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in those areas.
Sure. So in community development and trust, the major changes that you're seeing here is the employees first, public sector frontline workers. Back last fall, Governor Inslee, and this is how the law is set up, Governor Inslee negotiated a contract for frontline workers, and then the way it's supposed to work is that when the legislature comes into session, they can either vote to approve the negotiated contract or they can vote to reject it. Members of the House voted to approve it, and so this is where we get a significant boost on the House side. The Senate, by contrast, did not vote to approve it, and voted instead to make significant, much smaller increases in public sector frontline worker employee salaries and benefits. They technically cannot do that. They can either accept the proposal or reject it, but they sort of did this gimmick where they proposed something much smaller that, if the legislature rejects those contracts, then it simply goes back to Governor Inslee to renegotiate for them. So that's a big area, sort of the main area of driving increases in there, but there are also other important things. On the Senate side, for example, they proposed to sweep, I think about 70% of funding for the Attorney General's office. This is ongoing, normal, near general funding for the Attorney General, and replace it with a one-time backfill of revenues from a lawsuit against Volkswagen for its diesel tailpipe emissions. And so really looking to tear down funding in the long run for the Attorney General. The Senate also proposes a pretty dramatic reduction in the Office of Civil Legal Aid. It nearly eliminates it, and that's a really important investment to ensure that low-income Washingtonians have an opportunity to get a good legal defense when they need it. By contrast, the House makes significant improvements in the Office of Civil Legal Aid. So you can definitely see that when it comes to community development and trust, there is some major differences in what the two budgets prioritize.
And what about economic security?
So this is also another area of some major and fundamental differences. As Kelly noted, the Senate proposes some pretty radical, large reductions in this area. By contrast, the House proposes some promising increases. For one thing, the House does invest in the new Department of Children, Youth, and Families, whereas the Senate Republican budget proposal does not. The House would increase assistance for families that are striving to move out of poverty, to get assistance with rental housing and job training. It would also update these sort of arbitrary asset limits that we currently have, which prevent a lot of struggling families from being able to access this program. One example is, for example, say you are a woman with some kids and you're trying to escape from a domestic violence situation. If you have a car that may even just be worth a few $1,000s, the value of that car right now will prevent you from being able to access important benefits when you need them most. The House would raise these asset limits considerably to give access to more people who need these benefits when they're struggling. By contrast, the Senate Republicans would actually ransack about $63 million from the Work First program in order to fill holes in other parts of their budget. Rather than reducing arbitrary limits on access to these important programs, the Senate Republicans would actually increase restrictions in a way that would kick thousands of families off the program and render it inaccessible to thousands more. And then finally, when it comes to early learning, House Democrats would improve access to early learning, put more slots in our ECAP system, while Senate Republicans they backed off this a little bit in their final budget proposal that passed off the floor. But initially, they were talking about completely restricting the program just to 4-year-olds and phasing it out for 3-year-olds. They've again since backed off of that, but there are still no significant big improvements in early learning, which is a really important investment and one of the biggest bangs for the buck when it comes to what we can do to promote a just and prosperous future for all Washingtonians.
Before we move on, can you give us a quick 411, that means information, on healthy people and environment?
Sure thing. So the House makes some pretty good investments here, especially when it comes to improving mental health care. Many of you may be aware that the state has been told by the state Supreme Court that we need to significantly improve our mental health system, and the House does that. It makes big investments in expanding community-based facilities for mental health and improving, Western State Hospital, which is one of our state major mental health institutions. The Senate does do some increases in this area, and they deserve some credit for that, but not nearly enough compared to what is actually needed to build the kind of mental health system that we need. And it's also important to note that on environmental protection, the House, again, makes some big needed investments in ensuring that we have clean air and water. The Senate cuts access to those, and notably, it doesn't provide any funding to set up the Department of Ecology's new Clean Air Rule, which is an important rule that was put forward by the Inslee administration that would ensure we have lower carbon dioxide pollutants and other pollutants in our air.
All right. One of the main questions this legislative session has been how to amply fund K-12 schools. How do these budgets measure up on that point?
Sure. So as I'm sure many of you on the line are aware that K-12 funding is kind of the big elephant in the room when it comes to both of these budgets. This is supposed to be the year in which the legislature fully addresses the McCleary lawsuit, which under the state Supreme Court's ruling said the state has got to be pumping billions of additional dollars into K-12 to comply with that particular ruling. We did already do a previous budget beat on the two high-level proposals put forward by Senate Republicans and House Democrats, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I will say that they've essentially stuck with, in their budget proposals, with the broader approaches that they proposed earlier in session. The House, and that means that the House sticks with the laws and the plans for fully funding education that are already on the books, that we already have in place. And we think that that makes sense. It's not that the current plan, which is called for a prototypical school, doesn't have weaknesses associated with it. In particular, we think there should be much more attention paid to making sure that the prototypical school model embraced by the House and previous generations in the legislature, we think it's really important to make sure that that is takes into account the needs to ensure that we're closing the opportunity gap between white students and students of color throughout our state. But it is also true that that model is very evidence-based. A ton of work more than a decade of work has been sunk into researching out, finding out what the best fit for Washington State is, and there were many task forces, working groups, stakeholder outreach involved in putting that plan together. And so we think it makes sense that the House sticks with it. By contrast, the Senate essentially throws that entire plan out, and they sort of haphazardly threw together their own plan. And it is problematic in a lot of ways. They're still trying to figure out the funding of it. The numbers keep changing. But at a high level, what we know is that it would be pretty unfair to certain school districts throughout the state. There would be big winners and losers depending on who is getting funding and which districts that funding is being raised on. And as I mentioned, it's pretty hastily thrown together. The Senate plan would cut funding for many lower income students. It doesn't do nearly enough when it comes to special education. And it has a lot of what I think are best described as empty promises. For example, there's a provision in there that is designed to provide an incentive for teachers to teach in lower income school districts. And that's important. We certainly laud that. But the problem is that they define lower income school district in such a way that no school district in the state would be eligible for this added funding to pay teachers more to be there. It's an empty promise. It's just something they stuck in there to make the package look good, but it would have no actual effect. And so when you look at the chart on there, it looks like the numbers are pretty close, 7% versus 7.9%. The actual school systems that would emerge from these two plans would be very different. And as Kelly alluded to this levy swap concept earlier, the House plan is genuinely additive. In other words, it does reduce local property tax levies to a certain degree, but mostly it puts in a lot of additional revenue through the new revenue pieces that the House Democrats introduced. So there's a lot of additional funding that is going to be coming into schools, and we think that's the right approach. By contrast, the Senate Republican plan would essentially eliminate all local levies and then impose a new statewide levy to backfill the lost local levies. But the way it pencils out, there would be fewer. It's not even revenue neutral. There would be fewer overall property tax resources coming into the state and going into schools under the Senate plan than there are currently. And so they rely on big cuts and some other tricks that we may get into later in order to make it pencil out in the long run. So again, the bottom line is that while they look similar in terms of the number of state resources going into it, the actual details which matter are significantly different, and we think that the House plan makes a much more sensible step in the direction of fully funding good schools for our kids.
Thanks, Andy. Kelly, one of the other very important measures of a budget is whether it is equitable. We know that our state's tax code is the most upside down in the nation. So how do these two budgets address the inequities our tax code creates?
Well, you're right, Precious. We do have the most regressive tax code in the country, and if you're on this call, you have probably heard us say that before, and that's because it's really important. What it means is that we all pay more in taxes as a share of our incomes than the top 1%, and in fact, those with the very lowest income pay the very most. They pay 7 times more in taxes as a share of income than the top 1% do. So we're dead last in the nation on that. What that means is when we're talking about raising new revenue to fund these budgets, we have to enact revenue that improves equity. So let's talk a little bit about how each of these plans proposes to pay for the investments that they make and how that affects equity. Starting with the House revenue package, we think that this would make some pretty significant steps toward making the tax code more progressive. So for example, one of the things that it proposes to do is close the tax break on capital gains. We have been advocating for a capital gains tax for some time now. The capital gains tax proposed by the House would be a 7% rate on profits over $25,000 or $50,000 for a married couple. So it would be paid almost exclusively by the top 1%, and that's going to begin to even out our tax code. The package would also take steps to clean up the tax code by closing several wasteful tax breaks. A lot of them have been on the list of proposals in the past. They include the tax break for big oil extractors, the sales tax exemption for bottled water, and the preferential rate for prescription drug resellers. A couple of other things that the House's revenue package would do that we think could positively affect progressivity of our tax code is change the real estate excise tax, or you may have heard it called the REIT, from a flat rate into a progressive rate. So the REIT is paid each time that a piece of property is sold, and what this would do is change the rate from 1.28% right now, 1.28% right now, to a lower rate for properties valued at under $250,000, and then raise the rate for those properties valued at over $1 million. So that's going to start to turn that particular tax a little bit closer to right side up. It does a couple of other things that may increase progressivity, but we haven't fully analyzed them yet. It would make some reforms to the B&O tax to create a larger exemption for small businesses. It would also begin to level the playing field for out-of-state online retailers, to ask them to collect sales tax on the sales that they make in Washington State. And it would also modify the 1% levy growth limit, which is something, a change that we've advocated in the past, and it would help property tax revenues better keep up with the economic activity in our communities. So that's the House plan. The Senate, and we think that that's a pretty strong effort as far as progressivity goes and equity goes. The Senate budget, as we've alluded to, relies on a property tax levy swap, and it doesn't have any offsets for low-income residents. So one of our major concerns about the levy swap that we've talked about a lot in the past is that it doesn't actually raise the revenue that we need to fund schools, because it increases state taxes but it lowers local taxes. So it's really a shell game that doesn't include new net revenue. But the other problem with the Senate's plan is it doesn't do anything to actually make the tax code more equitable for low-income households. So our position on property taxes is that if you're going to raise property taxes, then you need to pair it with other reforms that protect low and middle-income households. Something that we've proposed to do that is the safeguard rebate, which would do just that for households making $75,000 or less. And the Senate plan just leaves that equity component out. And so that's on the revenue side, and those have huge impacts for equity. I won't go over again the things that Andy talked about on the spending side, but when you talk about cutting programs for the lowest income communities, for seniors and for people with disabilities, those spending choices have huge impacts for equity across our state.
Right. And I am right here. So Andy, Kelly told us earlier that both of these budgets balance, but that they do so in different ways. Can you rate the sustainability of each of these budgets if enacted? What structural differences exist that might explain how each of these plans would fare into the future?
Sure. So if you took a high-level glimpse and you looked at the 4-year balanced budgeting spreadsheets that the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council puts out in conjunction with OFM and a few other agencies, these look to be fairly similar in terms of, how do they net out? They go out to 2021. Both of them would reduce overall reserves relative to where we're at now to below $2 billion. And then unrestricted ending fund balances would be alarmingly low in both cases. But both of them show that we're sort of, we're getting less, able to maintain existing resources or existing levels of spending moving forward. But that also hides a lot of what's going on here and what we mean by a sustainable budget. What we mean by a sustainable budget is, have you crafted your spending and revenues in such a way that from one year to the next, for the foreseeable future, you can depend on having these important investments that we know help families and communities thrive and grow the economy for everybody. And that's a lot of where the difference lies. On a high level, what the House does is propose significant new spending in a lot of areas that we think are ripe for and need investment, especially education. But they propose a lot of additional revenues, almost dollar for dollar, to pay for those existing investments. And, new revenues from fairly rapidly growing resources, meaning we can be confident that they will keep up with it in the long run. And we think that is the right way to approach, from a high level, making sure that investments in communities and families are sustainable. By contrast, in order to get to this, 4-year outlook, the Senate Republican budget requires on a lot of gimmicks, magic asterisks, and other tricks in order to make their budget pencil out and balance out over this period. And that is not a responsible way to craft a budget in our view. One of the biggest magic asterisks that is baked into their education plan, for example, that I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention and that it ought to, is that it says in their education plan that after 2019, every dollar of additional revenue growth that comes in every year, so say we're in 2020, every dollar that comes into the state above 2019 levels, that dollar first has to go toward maintaining their new K through 12 education funding formula, which, as we've noted, doesn't really pay for itself already. So we now have new revenues coming in just to sustain that program. If there's any additional dollars left above that, those dollars then next have to go to reducing the new statewide property tax that they propose. So what we've said is new revenues have to go first to education, second to reducing the state property taxes, the foundation of funding for schools in our state, I might add, and then third, if there's any revenue after you funded property tax reductions, those revenues can go to health care, child care, public safety, environmental protection, all of the non-K through 12 education things in the state budget, including higher education, I might add. And so all of you are on the call are aware that no part of the budget is immune from the effects of price inflation. No part of the budget is immune from the growing of the population, and particularly the aging of the population, which has significant impacts on the cost of delivering especially healthcare services. And so what we really have here is a formula for, Kelly, help me out. You, in your draft of the script, you had an awesome description of it, and I'm blanking on it.
This isn't an education first budget.
No, there was another one, though, that you had written in. It was a kill switch or something.
Self-destruct switch.
Self-destruct switch baked into the plan. And so what it really is a prescription for gigantic cuts to everything not related to K through 12 education. And that is just one that is not a plan in any sense of the word. It's not courageous. It's simply pawning tough choices off on future lawmakers, saying, we're going to tell you that you have to cut spending now, but we'll leave it to you to figure out what actually has to be cut. And it's not a way to ensure that we maintain these important services, mental health, health care, parks, arts, all kinds of things that we know we need to build thriving communities from one year to the next. So my assessment overall, there's one other aspect on sustainability I want to cover, which is use of budget reserves. Both the House and the Senate would drain significant budget reserves in order to make their budgets balance. And the governor proposed doing so as well. And I would note that we have spoken out against doing that budget reserves are something that we are going to need the next time we enter a recession, and that could be any time now. We are overdue for a recession. And so now is not the time to be tapping our rainy day fund. So bad marks on both of them. But again, how those reserves are being used matters. And in the case of the Senate, where you're simply using reserves to fund your budget over the next 4 years and then hoping that you'll be able to cobble something together in the next budget, is different from what the House proposes. The House essentially proposes to draw funds down before some of their new revenues can come online. So for example, the capital gains tax couldn't come online until 2018 at the earliest. So they use reserves to ensure that they're funding stuff at the beginning, but they'll have new revenues coming online to replace those, and those will be ongoing. So it's not exactly equally bad marks. So my overall grade, House gets probably a B+ on sustainability, and the Senate gets a C-.
All right. So unfortunately, we are out of time. So just want to thank you all for joining us today, and many thanks to Kelly Smith and Andy Nicholas for leading this webinar. Save next Friday, April 14th, for the next Budget Beat, which will be on advancing racial equity in education. Details will be sent out this week. And stay tuned to our website, budgetandpolicy.org, for a recording of this call. After you sign off, a survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. Have a great rest of your week. Bye.